Hey, Why God Why listeners, this is Peter Englert. We are currently on a season and series break. We just finished the credibility of Christianity, and now we're moving into questions of our day. But we wanted to give you a bonus episode with Drew Dyck. Drew is an author. He's also a friend of the show. We hope you enjoy this special bonus episode. Thank you so much. Welcome to the Why God Why podcast. My name is Peter Englert. I am here with our guest, Drew Dyck. Drew is an author. He works in publishing. He's written all over the place. He just wrote a book called Just Show Up. And the question he's dealing with is, why isn't my calling more clear? Him and I, we have a nice little Twitter friendship that we're bringing to you live. This is our longest conversation. And this conversation is really part of a series called Questions of Our Day. You might be asking, why isn't my career more clear? Why isn't my calling more clear? You know, whether you're deconstructing or you're in a season of doubt or you're committed to a church, I think all of us can relate to this question of purpose. So with all that said, my Canadian brother, Drew, it's great to see you.
Hey, great to be here. And thanks for mentioning the Canadianness right off the bat. Although I got to say, I've been, south of the border for 22, 23 years. And so I don't feel very Canadian anymore.
Well,
but in my heart, I am.
Let's help you feel Canadian for just a second. So who's your hockey team? Do you have one?
Oh, well, this is complicated, but it was the Oilers. And you'll see how old I am. When they traded Wayne Gretzky to L.A., I was disillusioned, heartbroken, and then I just gave up on hockey at that point. But my first love was the Oilers.
Oh, okay. Did you watch that whole documentary from ESPN?
No, I want to though.
Oh, wow. You're like still in shock and pain. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, I'm still recovering, like 30 years later. Yeah. And then of course, like Canada hasn't won a Stanley Cup in like 20 years or something ridiculous. So
all right.
Well, it's just very unfair.
Well, last fun question before we get serious, because they got to get to know you. Like, is the Canadian dish poutine, or is there something else that you would say this is our Canadian dish? Or maybe you grew up mostly in Western Canada, I think. So I'd just be curious.
That's right. Yes, Alberta. So yeah, it's funny because I remember like at a previous job I had, they're like, Drew, we want to do like some Canadian dishes for this party that we're having. Like, what's a Canadian dish? And I'm like, I don't know, hamburgers. No, I mean, yeah, okay, poutine is one, right? But that's kind of like, and it's so good and it's so bad, right? It's just cheese curds and fries and gravy. It's like all the worst foods for you imaginable, and yet it tastes delicious. I like Nanaimo bars. Have you ever heard of those?
No.
That's from like, those are like specifically from BC, from British Columbia. But they're desserts, and I don't even know what's in them, but they're like chocolate and some custard, and they're just delicious. If you ever have a chance, people, to eat a Nanaimo bar, that's what we'll eat in heaven. So
hey,
better start now.
I love it. Well, this is a great way to introduce you, get started. Drew, why don't you share a little bit more about yourself than the food and the hockey stories that you have?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in the church, which was a mixed blessing. Actually, I mean, some people, it's a real struggle for them. My dad was a pastor, so I'm a pastor's kid. And so I got to see like a lot of good things and a lot of hard things, right? When you peek behind the curtain and you see kind of what goes on, the infighting, the craziness of church life. But overall, I'm grateful for it. Like I said, I moved, grew up in Canada, moved down to the States here in my early 20s, and had these kind of vague aspirations to be a writer. Didn't know how that would work out. Didn't know anyone who actually made a living doing that, and yet felt called to do that, and ended up getting an English degree, going to seminary, meeting my now wife. And that's why I'm still in the States. I was coming down for 6 months, and here I am like 20 years later. And, kind of stumbled into being an editor, and am a writer, of course, now. And so, yeah, I feel blessed. I still believe that God's changing people through the medium of the written word, even though we're in an increasingly visual culture. But I think back to my own spiritual journey and think of the different books that were instrumental in my faith. And so I feel blessed to be able to get to do that for others.
I find your story fascinating, and I want to kind of drill down with our question because when growing up, the only people that I heard feel called were pastors. And
Right.
It was like if you were called to be a missionary, it was like the highest calling. Then it was pastors, and then it was kind of everything else. And I'm just kind of curious, with your dad being a pastor and with you going to seminary, did you feel this weight or pressure to kind of pursue that calling?
Well, yeah, I had a similar experience to you as far as like how I thought about calling growing up, because you're absolutely right. Like missionaries were the A team, right? And if you couldn't do that, and like my parents were going to be missionaries, but then they had too many kids. And so their denomination wouldn't send them out. And they're like, oh, crap, I guess I got to settle for being a pastor, right? That's like, if the missionary thing didn't work out, you could be a pastor. And then if you were an absolute loser and you couldn't be either of those, I guess you could just go make money and send checks to the people doing the real work of ministry, right? So there was this very kind of two-tiered spirituality, and only the people that go into vocational ministry are actually called. Although, by the time I grew up and read a little more widely and realized that was kind of a bogus distinction, I'd kind of shed that. And actually I'd never really thought too seriously about going into vocational ministry. I just wanted to go to seminary to study about God and amass student loans. So that I didn't know how I was going to use it. It was like, people are like, what are you going to do with this degree? I'm like, no idea, but I'm super into reading theology. So anyway, yeah, don't be like me, kids, if you're listening to this and you have zero vocational objectives for the degree you're getting, and yet somehow it worked out.
Let me kind of ask you this, because, whether somebody is a skeptic or deconstructing, I feel like the word calling, resonates more. And as a millennial, the idea of calling, even if you're outside the church, it seemed like every millennial story was about some entrepreneur or somebody that sells everything they have to go to Africa to start this company. In the world today, as you've kind of engaged this topic with people that follow Jesus and don't, what do you kind of see that's changed about calling right now as we talk?
Yeah, I think it's a good thing in a way. I mean, it has a shadow side, right? Where if you're just all about self-expression, self-actualization, and you read everything through that grid about what you're supposed to do with your life as if it's the only thing, that can have a downside for sure. And yet, I mean, like, I think all of us want to know, like, God, what do you want me to do with my life? That's a rather important question, right? And the one distinction that really helped me was talking about common calling and particular callings. Theologians kind of make this distinction. I think it's a good one. There's the common calling. This is for Christians, where it's like you are called to love God and love others, right? That's not negotiable. If you're a believer in Jesus, you're a follower of Jesus. You don't have to sit there and go, should I really love my neighbor as myself? I don't know. Is God really calling me to do that? Right? Then there's the particular calling. It's like, okay, am I supposed to be a plumber or a party planner or a pastor or whatever it is? And that's a little trickier. And that's where we get really weird and kind of stress out and go, okay, what am I supposed to do? What if I miss it, right? What if I miss the boat and there was a sign in the sky that I didn't see, or flipping your Bible open to a random passage and hoping that it tells you what career you should go for, or what person you should marry, or if you should marry, or where you should live, right? Here's the thing that was really freeing for me to realize is that as you live out that common calling, that is loving God, loving others as best you can, and really trying to follow Jesus as best you can, the particular calling has a way of working itself out, of becoming clear. And you don't have to stress out about that and get the look for the sign in the sky or be worried that you're going to miss the boat. Or like the particular evangelical subculture in which I grew up, there was this idea that if you did one too many sins, somehow you're going to miss God's calling. I don't believe that. I believe in forgiveness. I believe in grace, right? And so God, in spite of our shortcomings, our failures, our inability to read signs, God will direct us as we do our best to follow Jesus.
Do you think we've put too much pressure on our careers?
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. You look at folks in the Bible, right? Like Paul, what was he? Technically, if you looked at him on paper, he was a tent maker, right? But is that what Paul was? No, he was the greatest missionary of all time, but he made his money making tents, right? And so and I know that's more like a job than a career, but I do think, especially in the West, right, where we glorify success and economic status, putting way too much pressure on our career. And yet at the same time, I don't want to discount it, because I think God really does care about what we do with our lives, not just, in our hobbies and our friendships and our community, but how we make our money, right? Is it ethical? B, is it somewhat fulfilling? I like the Frederick Buechner definition, where you're, I'm going to butcher it, but where the world's great need meets your heart's gladness. Look it up, because that is not the right wording. But that's great when that lines up. And yet we have to acknowledge, you look around the world, different parts of the world where people just do the same thing that their dad did or their mom did. They don't have a choice about what they did vocationally. Are they somehow less than us? No. And yet when we do have the opportunity to, when we have a few options and choices, why not try to do the best thing that you can with your life?
I want to get to your book, because I think your book addresses a lot of things that non-Christians and even Christians care about. We live in a culture that it's paralysis by analysis. So Aziz Ansari wrote the book Modern Love. There's been a lot, or Modern Romance, I think, and the fact that, you have unlimited people that you could date. Right. You think about careers, you have unlimited opportunities. And so you would think that would bring clarity, but it brings hesitation. And even something as simple like, the 20-somethings that I know, and we're like two old guys talking about this, but the 20-somethings I know, like, really, really want to make a difference, but it just seems harder than ever, because every single week, there's a new kind of crisis. There's a new opportunity. There's a new way to give. And I guess, how do you process over this world with unlimited options, almost unlimited callings? How are you trying to help people kind of assist in that area?
Great question. And you're absolutely right. There is a paralysis that happens when there are so many options. I love, there's an author, Pete Davis is his name, and he calls it infinite scrolling, or infinite scrolling mode, I think, right? Where, oh man, I'm butchering it, but it's, the Netflix phenomenon, where you get on there and there's so many things to watch, so many options, and that you spend hours just sitting there looking through all of them rather than committing to watching one show. And he contrasts that with what he calls long haul heroes. And he talks about people in his life, like a piano teacher who sat on the same bench in the same house on the same street for 25 years teaching kids piano, or a coach or a teacher, or even Mr. Rogers, who recorded all these episodes over all these years. And he talks about the long haul heroes are the people who ultimately make the greatest impact. Even if it's not some, huge world changing impact, they really do meaningfully affect the lives around them. And I thought, man, that's good, because it's so easy to be the person who just kind of infinitely scrolls through all the options and never commits, rather than the person who deeply invests in their community, in a place. And I think, there's this tendency to think like, oh, you need to just keep looking. There's so many options. But I'll tell you what, at the end of the day, I would rather have one mission than 1,000 options, right? And to commit. And you may not know, like, is this the right place, the right community to invest in? Is this the right career? Just start doing it, and then you'll be amazed at how that morphs and changes. But if you never actually sink your teeth into something, it's hard to make a difference, and it's hard to know where to go. So I do encourage people to commit wherever possible. And it also takes, a sensitivity to like God's leading, not to put a spiritual veneer on this, but like when you see needs arise, or you feel moved by something and you move in that direction, that's often an indication that's where you're supposed to go. But don't hold back. Just commit with all you have and see where it takes you. That's my advice.
I love it. So let's back up. I wouldn't say faithfulness is a bad word. It's actually one of my core values. Maybe this podcast is personal for me. But this book Just Show Up, you had to have like a reason, something that you were wrestling with. And then, talk to us about the impact, because what was it about this topic that you felt, I am uniquely ready to write this, but then what's the impact and the conversations that you've had about it too?
Yeah, no, it was, it might have been a bit of a midlife crisis that sparked the book, honestly, because, I was thinking back to when I was in seminary. My wife and I went down to Pasadena, California, and she worked on campus in an art center, and I was a student, and it's a great time of life. But I just remember how idealistic we were, and we had these big, grandiose visions of what we were going to do with our life, the things that we were going to do for God, right? It had a spiritual gloss on it, for sure. And that's good. I think there's a place for that when you're just starting out. And I remember telling her, like, I don't want the American dream. Like, we're not going to have the 2.5 kids and the white picket fence. We're going to do something different. And here I am, fast forward 20 years, 18 years, I guess. And yeah, we don't have 2.5 kids. We have 3. We live in the suburbs. I don't have a white picket fence, but I'd totally get one if I could afford it. And then the question becomes like, okay, God, what now? Like, how am I faithful with my life? And don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining. My life has turned out great. We have 3 wonderful kids, and I enjoy my career, and I feel fulfilled in my life. But there's this idea that, man, did I miss the boat because I didn't do something radical, that I wasn't that missionary, that I didn't go overseas, that I'm not living in abject poverty? And I think the answer to that is no, you can be faithful where God's planted you. And it doesn't have to maybe look like I thought it did when I was younger. But it just, faithfulness ultimately is what matters. And furthermore, it's a real head trip to think that you have to change the world. Like, these days, I don't have the energy. And so to just go, okay, you know what? That's God's job. God changes the world, not me. That's putting way too much on me. Now, God can change the world through people. I believe that. And as we're faithful in the little things, God does amazing things through that. But that's God's job. So that really makes my life a lot easier. I just have to go, okay, what's the next thing in front of me, God, that you want me to do? And that's kind of where the title comes from. It's like a mantra I'd repeat to myself. Just show up, Drew. Just show up. Even when you're tired, you don't know what to do next. Just show up for the people in front of you, the next thing God's placed in front of you, and see what happens.
So let's talk about calling just for a second. So if I go beyond your years, let me know. But talk to Drew as a teenager, as a 20-something, and then Drew as a 30-something. What do you know now, even from writing this book, that you wish you could have told your teenage self, your 20-something self, and your 30-something self?
That's good, man. Well, first of all, to my teenage self, I'd say, unfortunately, Drew, you're not going to make the NBA. You're not going to get tall enough. It doesn't matter how hard you work. It's not going to happen. So there'll be a little bit of disappointment there. To my 20-something self, though, you know what I'd say? Faithfulness is success. Faithfulness is success. Because I think, like, in your 20s, man, I was so focused on, like, I was so worried about my GPA. No one cares about my GPA. You know how many people have asked about my GPA? 0. Not even employers. Okay. And it was a good GPA, and I didn't even get to brag about it. I guess I'm doing it right now. Anyway, and you're like building your resume and all that kind of stuff, and you're sweating this stuff like as if it all matters. And it does in a way, but not maybe in the way that you'll think it does. So I'd tell my younger self to relax a little bit. Things are going to work out. I was kind of a late to launch guy anyway. I was living in my parents' attic when I was in my early 20s, staying up till 3 a.m, going absolutely nowhere. But you know what? Things have a way of working out. And I just encourage myself, be faithful. Also shed some of that kind of mentality that I have to be someone that changes the world. And because I think here's the cruel irony sometimes of that mentality. When you're focused on becoming a big deal, right? And maybe it's a spiritual thing. You just like, oh, I want to like be a voice to the nations or impact all these people. It can actually prevent you from the opportunities that God puts right on your lap. The people right in front of you. You can miss them. You can be so focused on being famous that you're not faithful, right? So that's another thing I tell my younger self. Chill out a little bit. Keep your eyes open to what God's placed right in front of you. And don't eat so much. I'm in my 40s now, okay? So it catches up with you.
You know, so I saw you at a conference, and, you know, you joked about your height with the NBA. You know, I talk a good 6'6". I dreamed of going to play basketball, but I'm only 5'6". So I'm there with you, brother. You know, so I'm in my midlife in some ways, and I've just been reading more and more. You know, again, we might be the same age, but I think what I'm kind of struggling with.
I think I got you, man. I'm in my mid 40s.
Okay.
So.
I don't want to make any assumptions, but anyways,
I know I have such a baby face.
There you go. I like it. And keep drinking that Moody Publisher cup. So that we love it. Free promo.
You see that? That I wasn't even trying to get the merch in there, but I had to have the plug.
We love publishers. Well, so going back to the midlife thing, one of the things that really kind of annoys me about this calling question, I'm facing it a little bit as a parent, where people come up to me very kind-hearted, and I appreciate it, and they're like, it's going to fly right by. And I'm still in my mind trying to figure out like how that's helpful. And like, even in my 20s, as I think about most of our listeners, like, people would say things. My wife's a mental health therapist, so to tell an anxious person to calm down, like it's just not helpful. Or to tell a 20-something, like, you have time. Like, I feel like every decade of our life, people are trying to give us this message that probably has some truth, but it's not received because we just live in this world. You're a little bit older than me. Like, I love my daughter, Lucy. I love Haley. Like, we had 15 minutes of a straight conversation without someone crying. I thought it was like the dream, and I think about when it could be a half hour. And so, I'm just kind of wondering if we just put pressure on ourselves because we put so many Band-Aids on this, like, hey, go make a difference. You can do anything. And then, so, I don't know. I'm just bringing up that thought. I don't know if that resonates with some of the advice that you gave, your past self.
Yeah, no, that's true. And one thing about, there's this assumption that older people have greater insight into your life phase than maybe they do. They have some, right? But the truth is, like, you forget what it's like day to day to be in a different life stage. Because, I get that too, because I still have fairly young kids. My kids are like, 12, 9, and 5. Right. And so, and then, older folks I get that all the time, man, it flies by. And I know that, I can see it already because it's already going fast. But at the same time, like, what's the expression? The years are short, the days are long. They forget the exhaustion of, like, when you finally get your kids down at like 10 p.m. They're supposed to go down at 8:30, but it didn't work and all this stuff. And then one gets up during the night. It's just like, you feel like you're in like a spin cycle and you're absolutely exhausted. And someone's like, oh, just enjoy it. Because of course they're 60. They remember all the beautiful moments and forget all the hard ones, which is great. But when you're in the thick of it, right, it's a different game. And so, of course you should slow down and smell the roses and enjoy your kids more. But it's tough. Life's tough. Every stage is tough. I even romanticize being in school. I'm like, oh man, I wish I could be in school. No real like responsibilities. No one's going to repossess my house if I screw up. But school was hard. I remember the tests, the pressure, the uncertainty about the future. And so have a little grace for yourself, whatever stage you're into. Older people, they have fuzzy memories. We can't tell you everything to do. Take the wisdom where you can. But I would say of any stage though, chill out a little bit, especially if you're a person that's kind of ambitious or kind of high strung. I think that's good advice, regardless of what stage you're at.
No, I love that. And where I kind of want to shift is, in kind of engaging and looking at your book and just kind of listening to you. I think maybe a lie or perception someone could be, even just by the title, Just Show Up, is just show up everywhere. And so how would you encourage people, we're not saying, hey, paralysis by analysis, but there's other people that it's like YOLO, maybe that's more millennial, but they don't want to miss out on an opportunity. How have you personally processed through, when do I need to do a boundary? When do I feel like it and do it? How have you processed that in this idea of just show up?
Yeah, no, that's a great point to bring up, because with this message, there's this idea that some people could take it and go, wow, okay, so I need to show up for everything and say yes to everyone. But of course, if you do that, you can't show up in a meaningful way for anyone because you're spread too thin, right? You're not infinite. You are a finite creature with limited time, limited willpower, limited abilities, all the rest of it, right? So you have to be intentional about what you show up for. And actually, I have a whole chapter in the book called Let Something Slide. Basically, and I give the silly example of my yard. Like, I had dreams for a while of having this beautiful manicured green lush yard. Hasn't happened for various reasons. Maybe I'm too lazy, but I came to the point where I was like, you know what? This is the kind of yard that kids dig for worms in and ride their bikes over. And it would require a lot of money and time I don't have to sit there and fuss over it. So I'm going to let that slide at this stage of life. Maybe when I'm older, I'll have a nice yard. But right now, I just don't have the time. I have a busy family life, busy career. And so you have to identify those things that, at this stage of life, and I'm not going to feel guilty about it. I can't do it. I can't be part of the PTA, or I can't volunteer for this role right now because I'm too busy here. And then, of course, that's easy to say. But then the real hard thing, and this is what you asked me about, how do you determine what you sideline and what you commit to? That's where it gets tricky. And one thing for me, like when I look at the commitments that I have, I mean, some are non-negotiable. I can't be like, yeah, I'm not going to be a dad this year. I'm just going to shelf that. Of course not, right? Or do my job. But there are a lot of kind of optional commitments that I have. And when I look at a commitment, I think, should I drop this? And if I think about dropping it and my primary emotion is relief instead of grief, then maybe that's a sign that, hey, that's something I should offload. And then I talk to people around me, especially my wife, and like, hey, should I? And she'll be like, yeah, you're not really good at that anyway. Why don't you let that go? And I'll tell you what, when I've done that, I've never regretted it, because you think like, oh man, I'm going to disappoint someone or I'm going to regret it. But usually when you drop it, you don't. And you actually realize it's better because you have more energy for the things that you are called to. So yeah, that's a great point. We need to be intentional about what we're taking on, because if you just take on everything, you get spread too thin, and then you're not showing up for anyone.
I'm going to ask you kind of a tough question that kind of deals potentially tough, that deals kind of with your industry. So Christianity Today, they did a whole article on publishing and how hard it is to get published because, like you need 10,000 followers or influencers. And, I'm bringing this up because in a lot of studies, Gen Z, like the number one thing that teenagers want to become is like a YouTube sensation. Right. And I don't want to like overdo that. And you're writing a book, Just Show Up, and it's about faithfulness and consistency. And sometimes like the grass doesn't get green. How do you manage all of those tensions of you're part of an industry that it's about clicks, likes, follows, even you, like we can even talk about, there's you're an editor, acquisitions person, but you're also a writer. How are you kind of managing this new frontier of like the facts are the facts, like either, people are following you or they're not, but that's not necessarily the best indicator of success? Yeah.
Well, my plan is to become a TikTok sensation, but I got to work on my dancing. So we'll see how that goes. But for real, it is a tension, especially when you're a Christian, right? Because you can't just go like, that's it, I'm going to get famous and become a big deal and try to become, powerful or whatever it is, because that's not the goal ultimately. It's about God. It's about other people. And so you really have to be careful, because it can be destructive to your soul if you get too caught up in the game of trying to get visibility, and maybe not even famous, but like success, whatever that means online, going viral, getting lots of followers. In my thing, selling lots of books, right? And I'll be honest, it's a temptation. Like it's tempting for me just to kind of obsessively go and check my Amazon ranking. Okay, what's it at? How many books are selling? What kind of reviews am I getting? And yeah, that can get out of balance really fast. So it's a tension to manage, but at the same time, for most of us, especially if you're in an industry like this, you can't just go, okay, that's it, I'm going to check out and live like a monk in my cabin in the woods. That's not an option either. So yeah, it's a constant kind of heart check thing where you're asking yourself your motivations. Why am I doing this? When is it getting a little too about me? And some of it I hate, because yeah, it's the new reality. Like I'll be honest, in publishing, when someone comes to us with a book idea, obviously we're evaluating the book idea first, their ability to write. That's all huge. But we're also going, okay, What's their position? How many followers do they have online? Can they get the word out about this book? So that's definitely part of the consideration. And the way I encourage people to, and I'm speaking out of my own context of like book, authors, is not to think of it in terms of like blowing up and becoming a big deal, but just going, who am I serving? Right. Even if it's like you just got a Facebook group that's built around a certain topic and you're helping people on that topic, that counts. That's awesome. Whatever medium it's on. Instead of thinking about it like, oh, how big a deal am I? How many people are following me? Thinking about how can I serve people well? And I usually find that if you do that, if you really do have a heart to serve people and you're dedicated to like developing the expertise and the ability to communicate on those topics, then you will have some sort of platform. It's a dirty word, but like some sort of audience that's willing to connect with you. But yeah, it's constantly having to just recalibrate and going, wow, is this becoming too much about me? That's why I just make dumb jokes on Twitter just to kind of, bring myself down a peg.
Well, let's get practical to our listeners. So I'm a 24-year-old. I'm named Greg. I question Christianity, but I'm open to it. And I'm listening to you talk. And what's unique that Christianity brings about calling that I might not sense? I probably sense the pressure to be a big deal somehow, whether it's online, whether it's success, or even just the curated life. What in your mind is so unique about following Jesus that either allows you to navigate that question better or maybe provides relief in a world that just feels so pressured?
Yeah. Well, I'd probably bring it back to the concept of grace, right? That's God's unmerited favor. I remember reading about C.S. Lewis when someone asked him what's distinctive about Christianity. He says, easy, that it's grace, right? That's a concept that's absent from other religions, where this idea that even though we mess up, even though we're sinful, God loves us and forgives us. And I think that applies to calling too, in the sense that like when you're a follower of Jesus, there's this tremendous freedom in realizing that it's not all about you, right? That it's not all on your shoulders. Ultimately, God has a bigger redemptive plan for humanity, and you're a minor character in that drama. And somehow that's freeing, and it kind of takes the pressure off. And like I was saying earlier, if you just focus on following Jesus, loving others, loving God, then God's going to do something in you and through you. And it's not all on your shoulders. Because I think that's a real head trip if you're like, man, I'm just setting out by myself against the world and I have to do something big. And then, of course, when inevitably you fail to do something that lives up to your ideals or your dreams, and you've seen all the stats about people in their 20s or teenagers thinking they're going to be famous by a certain age. Well, spoiler alert, that doesn't happen for most people, the vast majority. And then there's this sort of guilt like, wow, why did I fail? What happened? And when you're a follower of Jesus, you don't have to worry about that. You can abandon the outcomes of your life to God. I like that. So it's not just all on you, and there's freedom in that. So yeah, I think that's what I'd say is that there's a freedom in self-forgetfulness too. It's hard to get there, and yet if you can, you're really freed to love others well.
I want to shift a little bit, and this is like you and me are having coffee in the Northwest, which, by the way, someday I want to go visit the Northwest. Haven't been there yet.
Come on out.
I made the classic East Coast mistake. I went to like Southern California. I was like, I should go check out San Francisco, and it's like 8 hours away, but that's a whole nother topic. So, one of the books I really appreciated that you wrote was about self-control. And I'm kind of curious, what connections do you see between just showing up, faithfulness, and self-control, and how does that meet our culture today in a world that those two things, I wouldn't say people dislike them, but it's not easy to live out?
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, I have a knack for picking the sexy topics, don't I? Yeah, self-control is not exactly a popular virtue, and just showing up's hard, especially because we're all like just digitally connected, and that physical presence piece is so hard. I think there is a connection because, I mean, first of all, to show up for other people, especially, it takes self-control, right? Because by definition, self-control, even if you're doing something good and it's easy, doesn't really take self-control, right? But if you're exercising self-control, it means you're doing something hard. Usually you're setting aside your selfish interests to think about someone else. And it's just, I would say, impossible to have good relationships without self-control. You can't be faithful to a spouse without self-control. You can't be honest without self-control. So whatever virtue you're talking about, and I expand on this in the book about how self-control is this sort of foundational virtue that enables you to grow in all the other areas of your life. But if you don't have it, you're really in trouble. And I think that's true too when it comes it's hard to show up for the work that God's placed in front of you. That's not easy. Even if you have a conviction, this is what I'm supposed to do. Man, walking that out is hard. Like, I feel like I'm supposed to be a writer, but I'll tell you what, when I open up that blank Word doc, it's awful. It's like, this is terrible. I just want to get out of here. I just want to scroll on my phone. So it takes self-control to do that. It takes self-control to help people when they're in need. So yeah, I definitely think there's a connection there, but I hadn't really thought about it until this point. It's funny because when it comes to like writing books, at least for me, writing nonfiction books, they all grow out of a challenge that I've had in my life or something I've been thinking about. I mean, the self-control one, I wasn't even thinking about writing a book. I was just researching the topic and reading all these books, Christian books and secular books about the topic. And then all of a sudden, halfway through reading, I'm like, hey, maybe there's a book here. And so, yeah, that's that. But I do believe there is a connection there. So
let's talk recently, because I think the foundational points of being faithful just show up, to kind of really engage your calling. What's something that people wouldn't see necessarily on X or Instagram that you do that it's kind of your, it's a visible symbol of living out the principles of the book? Like what's that example for you?
Wow, that's tough because I like to brag about all the good things I do on Twitter, or what do they call it, X now?
He's an entertaining follow. It causes me to smile a lot.
You.
So there you go.
Thank you. So, yeah, I don't get enough validation at home, I feel like, from my kids and my wife, especially about my jokes, and so I have to go online and find that there. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have a heart for kids, especially mine. And just, I don't know, the little things of being there for friends and community. And honestly, it's an area which I'm still struggling because like I joke like, oh, I love people theoretically, but actually being there for them sometimes is hard for me. It's not natural. I'd rather send a text than go to someone's house. I'd rather, teach on a topic than maybe live it out sometimes. And so I'm still growing in that area. But I live a pretty boring but fulfilling life. Just with the community I have around me, lots of family in the area. We don't plan our weekends; they're planned for us, it seems. And yet it's a very rich and fulfilling life. So I'm grateful more than anything. And in the other thing too, like, I make a lot of dumb jokes online and I'm a pretty easygoing guy, but I also struggle with anxiety. I have an anxiety disorder. I talk about that in the book a little bit and how I've had to navigate that. That's been tough. And my wife will say like, yeah, people just think you're this big goofball, but you kind of have this other side to you where you struggle with like melancholy and anxiety and depression. So that's another side to things that I continue to struggle with. And you know what? Some of those things, like you think, man, when it struck me in my 20s, I thought, oh, I'll get over this. This maybe be a 6-month thing. And here I am still struggling with it. I think in better ways, in healthier ways. And yet it's an ongoing challenge. So, yeah.
Let's talk about that a little bit. I know we're coming to a close soon. I think first of all, you should buy the book, read the chapter. So let's kind of start there. But, I'm sure somebody writing about just show up and facing anxiety and faithfulness, sometimes it's like, just get over it. So why don't you kind of tell people, how you experienced it, how you've kind of come through it and where you are at now, because I think that would be helpful. This isn't a book to just tell you to push through it either.
Right. Yeah. And that's certainly for people that are dealing with some mental illness issues. That is not helpful when people just say, don't, if you're dealing with worry, just don't worry about it, or calm down, or right. And yet I've been really concerned and intentional about not letting anxiety derail my life, because sometimes it'd be easy just to kind of stay home to avoid certain opportunities. I remember even when I started writing, I'd get invitations once in a while to speak. And my wife, Grace, caught me in this. She's like, "You're just not replying to these." And I was like, "Yeah," because I was too scared to do it. Right. But then often when you face into your fears, right, they get smaller. And so that's been huge. And also the big thing too, when it comes to mental illness of any kind, I would imagine, especially anxiety and depression, is making sure you have that community around you. And that's what I didn't have when I first experienced this in my 20s. And that was a big mistake, because I thought, and maybe this is part of being a dude, I was like, no, I'm gonna take care of this myself. I wouldn't even tell people about it. It's so weird. Like, I'd have someone else tell me, like, yeah, I really struggle with anxiety. And I'd be like, oh, tell me about that. Sounds hard. I'll be praying for you, man. Like, and not even tell them that I was going through the exact same thing. And so I've just really learned to be more open about it. And you know what? People don't care. People don't judge. Things have changed. There used to be more of a stigma around this kind of stuff. But even in the church, I felt like that's changed a lot for the better, which is great. And often people will just go, yeah, man, I deal with that too, or something similar. And so I feel like when you're vulnerable about it, it just gives people permission to talk about it as well. But yeah, it's an ongoing thing. But man, relationships are huge when it comes to that issue. You don't want to be a lone ranger. Lone rangers are dead rangers.
Well, so like when you were in your 20s, because self-control and faithfulness all kind of, what did it look like? Was it, a spinning mind? Were you, getting just a knot in your heart? Were you pacing? Like, what did it look like?
Yeah, panic attacks. I didn't know what they were at that point, right? Thought I was dying. Convinced that I had some terminal disease for a while, because I was having all these strange symptoms. Of course, looking back, I realized I was like at a really high stress time. I was working and, getting my master's degree and terrified about what I was going to do in the future and all this stuff. And waking up, couldn't sleep, pacing, wouldn't eat for days at a time. Just awful. What I now know were panic attacks, anxiety. And so, yeah, it was a huge challenge, because up until then, my life had been pretty good. It'd been like pretty chill, and and then I really resisted the idea that I had something wrong with my brain. I was like, no. Yeah, I'm a strong person. This is not me. And I'd argue with doctors. I'm like, no, you don't understand. There's something physical wrong with me. It's not anxiety. I resisted getting on medication for years. Finally agreed to do that, and it was helpful. Now I'm not on medication, but if I recommend with people, if you need medication, you need to do it. So yeah, it was something that really rocked my life. It also humbled me. I think that was good. Some of these things can take you out of the knees. Like, I'm a really opinionated person, and I, was maybe a little cocky, probably still am, but man, that had a way of humbling me for sure. So
I think this is probably a good place to kind of bring it to a close. I'm really glad that you went there, and I know it's not easy to share. And the kind of the two questions, the two ways. So why isn't my calling more clear? We could talk about someone that's super confident, maybe overly confident, but I think the majority of us are kind of super anxious, and that manifests itself as, I have to get everything done tomorrow, or I'm going to hesitate and do nothing. How do you know, kind of with just show up and finding, why isn't my calling clear? How do you know when to push yourself within your anxiety versus, maybe my anxiety is pushing me to do this?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. I don't know if I have a great answer for that. But when it comes to pursuing your calling, incidentally, I haven't figured it out myself, right? It's funny, because I always thought like this is like a question for 20-year-olds. And of course, I think it is more pressing at that age, or in your 20s. And you always envy that person that's like, from the time they're 5, like, I'm going to be a nurse or whatever. It's like they just know, right? There's like those few people. It was never like that for me. And here I am in my 40s, and I'm still kind of like, God, what do you want me to do? And it's, yeah, sure, some puzzle pieces have fallen into place, but there's still some blank spots. Anyway, so, but what I consider, or when it comes to the anxiety thing, try not to make decisions based on fear. That's what I'd say. Easier said than done, right? But when there's something that you're like, man, there's like a deeper part of you that goes, I think God wants me to do that. I think I'm called to that. I think that I have something to contribute in this area. And yet I got this social anxiety or whatever it is, and it's uncomfortable. Don't listen to the anxiety. Listen to that nudge in your soul that's a little deeper. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean that you don't have to get rest, that you don't have to, don't burn yourself out doing these things. Be mindful of your limitations, and certain mental health challenges come with extra limitations that other people don't have. But don't let your life get cramped. Don't let the walls kind of shut in on you. This is how people with, like, what's it called? Agoraphobia, where they can't leave the house. They have a panic attack in the grocery store, and they go, okay, no more grocery stores for me. Then it happens on a plane. No more flying for me. Right. And I'm not blaming them. It's an awful thing, but your world gets smaller and smaller. And that can happen in sort of a different way if you bow to fear too often. And the other thing last thing I'd say about that is just that don't look too far down the road. That's paralyzing, especially if you're prone to worry and anxiety, because you're like, oh, I got to think about what I'm going to be doing in 5 years or 10 years. And oh, my goodness, am I doing enough? Am I going the right direction? Just look at today. Jesus talked about this. He said, give no thought for tomorrow. That's the old translation. Give no thought for tomorrow, what you'll do, what you'll wear and eat and stuff like that. Today has enough problems of its own. Isn't that true? Just focus on today. It's the only day that you can actually live in anyway. So the more you can focus on today, the better off you'll be.
You probably, are you more introverted or extroverted?
I do those tests. I come down like right in the middle, just slightly to the extroverted side.
Okay. Well, so when you talked about fear being like, what's the motivation? I tend to be kind of the opposite of like fear holds me back to do nothing. It's actually, and I was just kind of thinking of applying it for me. I'm scared if I don't do that.
Interesting.
What will happen? I'll just be transparent, doing this podcast, for some reason, I don't know if it was bad pizza. We don't have poutine. We have garbage plates. Google it for Rochester, New York, but they pour grease.
I've heard of those.
But okay. But like for some reason I woke up one day and I was like, to host a podcast, I have to be posting 5 days a week. And the fear is like, if I don't post on behalf of the podcast, like it's all going to go away. And, I think you had a beautiful way of talking about it, because I'm sure the majority of people, the reason why their calling's not clear, the reason why they don't show up is actually because they're scared and they do nothing. But there's a segment of us that we're actually scared if we don't do it, how that messes up. And no one sits there and tells you like, no one really cares, like in a loving way. Like, if as a pastor, I mean, I officiated a funeral last week. If I don't show up for that funeral and I can be scared, like there's a greater responsibility. But, even for me, the way that I'm kind of applying it is if you're so scared that something isn't going to happen, that's probably not a good reason to do it.
Yeah, that's right. No. And that's where you have to kind of do the deeper evaluation of, is this something I'm really called to? And then once you determine, say that it is, then you fight through the fears. And it sounds like maybe what you're dealing with is, and I deal with this as well, a form of perfectionism where you go, okay, if I'm going to do this, I've got to do it like to the max, and it's got to be amazing, and it's got to be perfect. And like you said, I got to post 5 times a week. And then that has a paralyzing effect, right? That can freeze you and keep you from doing it, instead of kind of having an incremental approach and just go, okay, I'm just going to do the first part of this, and then another little part, see where it goes. And maybe, and here's the thing people don't tell you when you're young. Maybe you just do it halfway for a while, warm up to it, see where the success is. And then all of a sudden you go, oh, now I have my schedule shifted. I have a little more time to devote to this. Now I really hit the gas, right? But man, I mean, how many things are we kept back from? Because we think that to start even, we have to have it totally figured out or be amazing at it. But like people, I've seen 100 times where it's like, listen, the first time you do something, you're going to suck at it. And you have to be comfortable with that. That's tough, especially if you're a perfectionist. But if you don't start, you'll never get there.
No, that's great. Well, this conversation's gone by really fast. What we do is we do final remarks. And so I'll just kind of give some of my thoughts, and then whatever heresy or mess I leave, you can clean up. Does that sound good?
Perfect.
As you were drinking coffee, just like the waiter that comes in and says, hey, do you want anything else? And you just ate some poutine, but we won't go there. So anyways, I think the reason why I was really excited about this episode is I just sense, I hope you listeners have seen that this question, why isn't my calling clear? It's not just a 20-something. And I think, Drew, you just said it, but also like we've been talking about it before, that maybe what God's asking of us, whether you're following Jesus or not, it's not as clear big picture wise, but it's super clear in the little picture, or however we would say that. And, something that I've been reflecting on lately is, am I asking more of myself than God's asking of me? And, even kind of going back to this idea of like just showing up, probably the most meaningful things that have happened in my life are things that aren't on social media. From, like I mentioned, officiating a funeral, being with my daughters, even, I feel this pressure as an extrovert that I'm always the one initiating things. But even just to find the purpose that, as an initiator, you're serving and just providing people the opportunity to show up is just a beautiful thing, and how much people really, really appreciate that. So I just think with our calling being so clear, maybe it's time to zoom in as opposed to zoom out. And I think that that's kind of the big thing that I'm learning, maybe focusing more on our common calling from God and not our particular calling.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I didn't detect any heresy. I might be getting sloppy, but I think that's a good word. It's like, zooming in a little bit on your life rather than, and listen, I understand goals, long-term planning, vision, all that stuff is important, right? But I think sometimes we overemphasize that, to be honest. And because, it's funny because I actually love like scheming and dreaming about the future. What I don't love is doing the hard thing right in front of me. And so, but of course, the latter is more fruitful. And so I think having that kind of narrowing your scope a little bit can be really helpful. And then also, being a little easier on yourself, that you're not in this alone, right? Especially if you're following Jesus, God's got a plan. It's not all contingent upon your awesomeness. You can relax a little bit. God's going to do what God's going to do, and he's going to use you. But you don't have to be perfect for that to happen. So chill out a little bit and enjoy the ride, because it does go by fast.
Well, Drew, there's a lot of irony in what I'm about to ask you, but where can people follow you online and see?
Yes. So as you know, I spend too much time on X, formerly known as Twitter. So you can always connect with me there. I also have a website, which is just my name, drewdyck.com. My last name's D-Y-C-K. And you can see some cheesy pictures of me and my family. You can read a free chapter from the book. And then, of course, if you're in the Northwest, drop by and we'll have some coffee and go to Powell's, the best bookstore in the world. A whole city block bookstore. It's amazing.
You know what? I wouldn't expect an editor to close any other way. So thank you so much for joining us. You can find more about us at whygodwhypodcast.com. Click the subscribe button. You'll get an email with this episode and many others to come. Thank you so very much.